She had spent 3 years pretending to be nobody, and it was working right up until the moment a dying Navy SEAL got wheeled through the trauma doors and looked straight at her, like she was the only thing standing between him and a body bag. Dr. Wade Corbin had just shoved her into the supply cart hard enough to send syringes skidding across the tile floor, screaming at her to get out of his trauma bay, that she was a liability, that she didn't belong anywhere near his patients. And then Commander Jonas Reel bleeding through every layer of his tactical gear, barely able to lift his head turned toward her, with eyes that had seen things most people couldn't survive, and whispered words that stopped every person in that room cold. You don't know who she is. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories on this channel are the kind that will make you forget to breathe. This one especially. Stay until the very end, because every single detail matters, and I promise you the ending will hit differently than you expect. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all started. Norfolk, Virginia sat heavy and gray in February, the kind of cold that rolled off the Chesapeake before dawn and found every gap in your coat before you made it from your car to the building entrance. The city moved differently at night, quieter, on the surface louder underneath, the way port cities always operated when the day shift handed everything off to the people who worked in the dark. Harborview General Hospital sat 3 blocks from the waterfront, a mid-size regional trauma center that handled everything from construction accidents to overdoses to the kind of injuries that came in without paperwork and left the same way. It was the kind of place that never fully slept and never fully rested. And the people who worked its night shift knew that about themselves, too. Mara Voss had been working nights here for 2 years and 8 months. She was 32 years old, with dark circles she had long stopped bothering to conceal in hands that moved through a trauma bay like they had independent opinions about where they needed to be. She was not the kind of nurse who introduced herself with a warm smile and asked patients what their pain level was on a scale of 1 to 10 with theatrical concern. She asked once. She recorded the answer, and she was already doing something about it before the patient finished speaking. The other nurses on her shift respected her in the quiet, unspoken way that people respected someone who never panicked, never grandstanded, and never wasted emotion. The residents sometimes instinctively followed her instructions before they caught themselves and remembered she wasn't the one with the medical degree. Then they did it anyway, because experience had a way of announcing itself through behavior, even when it didn't announce itself through credentials. Dr. Wade Corbin had noticed none of this in the 2 years and 8 months they had worked together, because Dr. Wade Corbin did not pay attention to nurses unless they were doing something wrong. He was 47, a trauma surgeon, whose regional reputation he wore like a second skin. Tall and broad-shouldered, with silver at his temples that photographed well at hospital fundraisers, and the kind of professional confidence that had started his competence, and slowly, over years, hardened into contempt. He was technically skilled. Mara had observed enough of his work to know that the skill was real. But in his hands, skill had curdled into certainty, and certainty had curdled into the specific arrogance of a man who had been excellent for so long he had forgotten that other people could be excellent too. He spoke to the nursing staff the way certain people spoke to service workers, with the expectation that they would produce exactly what he wanted and offer no commentary in return. He had a particular way of not seeing Mara, not ignoring her. That would have required acknowledging she existed, simply not registering her as a person worthy of inclusion in his field of attention. She was furniture. She was infrastructure. She was part of the system that existed to support him, and systems did not have perspectives. Mara had learned to manage him over those 2 years and 8 months. She said yes, doctor, and right away, doctor, and moved around him, the way you learn to navigate a piece of furniture in a room you'd memorized without thinking about it, without resentment, just efficiently. She didn't challenge him in front of patients. She didn't make him look bad in front of residents. She kept her head down and her hands busy, and she completed every shift and drove home in the dark and made coffee in her apartment alone and did it again the next night. Survived. That was the honest word for it. She had gotten good at surviving. She had years of practice. The night of February 7th began like most others. She took report from the evening charge nurse at 11, checked her assignment board, verified that Bay 3's crash cart had been restocked after the afternoon code. Blue, it hadn't, and she restocked it herself rather than filing a report and waiting, and poured herself half a cup of coffee she would finish at some point between 2 and 4 in the morning. The ER had 11 patients in the queue by 11:15. A teenage boy with a fractured wrist, a 58-year-old woman with chest pressure that looked cardiac, an elderly man with a cellulitis infection in his left leg that should have been treated a week before he'd finally come in. Mara moved between them the way water moved through a system, without ceremony, finding the path of greatest need. At 11:40, a 7-year-old boy arrived by ambulance. He had fallen from a second-floor window, unclear exactly how. The mother was too distraught to give a coherent account, and he was small and ashen, with blood matted into brown hair that still carried the faint smell of whatever shampoo had been used on it that morning. One eye tracked. The other was wrong. Mara saw it before the paramedic finished his handoff report, before Finch, the second-year resident assigned to the bay, had looked up from his tablet. "Left pupil," she said to Finch, low and direct. "It's blown." Finch leaned in, looked, and went still in the particular way that medical students and young residents went still when the theoretical suddenly became specific and real and present in front of them. "She's right," he said, mostly to himself. Mara had the crash cart repositioned and the neurokit open before Corbin pushed through the trauma bay doors. He assessed the scene from the threshold the way he always did, with the deliberate pause of a man who wanted the room to register his arrival, then moved to the bedside and looked at the child. "CT," he said. "Get him to imaging. His ICP may already be rising," Mara said. "If we send him down without, did I ask for your assessment?" "Doctor, with a blown pupil and the mechanism of injury." Corbin turned and looked at her with the specific expression he reserved for people who had made the mistake of speaking to him directly. It was not angry exactly. It was something colder and more deliberate, the expression of a man who wanted you to understand that your voice in this room was an inconvenience he was generously tolerating. "Move," he said. And when she didn't immediately step back, because she was watching the child's his color, reading the signs, she was reading. Corbin put his palm flat against her shoulder and shoved. Hard enough to matter. Hard enough that she hit the supply cart with her hip and heard the clatter of syringes hitting the floor. Hard enough that Finch looked away. Nobody said anything. In the silence that followed, Corbin turned back to the patient and issued instructions about CT prep. Mara steadied herself against the cart. She looked at the boy's face. She looked at his unequal pupils. She looked at the color draining from his skin. Then she stepped back to the bedside. "Finch," she said. Her voice was level, completely level. Not quiet in the way of defeat quiet, in the way of someone who had made a decision. "Draw up 0.1 milligrams per kilo of mannitol. Now, move." Finch looked at Corbin's back. Then he looked at Mara's face. He drew up the mannitol. Corbin was already on his phone, directing the CT suite, not watching. He didn't see Finch administer the medication. He didn't see the next 3 minutes during which Mara monitored the child's breathing, adjusted the oxygen delivery, and talked in a low, continuous stream to the boy. Not because he was fully conscious, but because she had learned in conditions far worse than this one that the sound of a calm voice had physiological effects that monitoring equipment didn't always capture. When the transport team arrived to take the boy to imaging, he was more stable than he had been when he arrived. Measurably so. Corbin signed the order and walked out without looking at her. Mara watched him go. Professional. She bent down and picked up the syringes from the floor, one by one, and dropped them in the sharps container. She washed her hands at the bay sink, dried them on a paper towel, and went to find her next patient. This was the thing about people like Corbin. They assumed that because you kept working after they humiliated you, the humiliation hadn't reached you. They confused endurance with acceptance. They thought your silence agreed with their assessment of you. They didn't understand that some people went quiet for entirely different reasons, because the quiet itself was protective, because the noise they could make would cost more than anyone in the room was prepared to handle. Mara had been quiet for 3 years. She was good at it by now. The radio crackled at 11:57. She was in Bay 6, finishing a wound irrigation on a man whose forearm had lost an argument with a bandsaw. Clean cut, manageable, no arterial involvement. The kind of case that demanded precise, careful work, but not urgency. She was halfway through the closure when she heard the charge nurse's voice change, registered in the hallway outside. Not the words. You couldn't catch words clearly through 2 sets of doors, but the frequency. Experienced ER nurses developed a sensitivity over years to that specific pitch that meant something had moved from bad to a different category entirely. Mara finished the irrigation, taped the temporary dressing, told the patient she'd be back in 10 minutes, and walked to the nurse's station. Dolores, the charge nurse heavyset, 14 years at Harborview, the kind of unflappable competence that kept trauma departments functional when everything else was going sideways, had a phone pressed to one ear and was gesturing with the other hand at the trauma coordinator. Her face was doing something that Dolores's face almost never did. "What's incoming?" Mara said. Military casualty. Dolores lowered the phone for a second. Federal transport. They gave almost nothing. On Origin Dispatch was weird. The call came through a different channel than normal. Whoever it is, they're saying critical, and the transport team is some kind of federal unit, not standard ambulance. Something moved through Mara, not quite a feeling. More like the space where a feeling would be a stillness that preceded information the body understood before the mind caught up. ETA? 2 minutes. She was already walking. The trauma bay she prepped in the next 90 seconds was textbook, large bore IVs staged and labeled, blood products requested from the bank, rapid infuser primed, ultrasound positioned at bedside, crash cart checked and unlocked. She positioned Finch, who had followed her from the hallway, with the slightly lost look of man who had accepted that following Mara Voss was generally the correct professional decision at the supply station, and told him exactly what she would need and in what order. He nodded and began staging without asking questions, which meant he'd been paying attention these last several weeks. The ambulance bay doors opened. The gurney came through fast 2 men in tactical clothing who moved like federal agents, not EMTs, flanking a military transport medic who was speaking rapidly and quietly into a phone. The man on the gurney was large, broad, through the chest and shoulders, dressed in what remained of tactical gear that had been cut away in sections to access wounds during transport. His face was the color of old concrete, controlled in the way of someone who had trained himself to maintain consciousness through force of professional habit rather than physical capacity. He had a pressure dressing on his abdomen that had saturated through its outer layer. There was a second wound at his left shoulder, packed but seeping. His hands were visible at his sides, a detail Mara clocked automatically and filed. He was alive, but the margin was narrowing. She moved to the head of the gurney before it fully stopped. Gunshot wound right flank, penetrating trauma left shoulder, suspected hepatic hemorrhage, the transport medic said, handing her the field care card. Pressure was 74 systolic on departure, dropped to 68 en route. He's received 2 liters crystalloid. And how long ago was that abdominal dressing placed? Mara asked, already reading the card. 31 minutes. It needs to come off. There's active hemorrhage underneath the saturation line. She looked up at the man's face. His eyes were open, dark, exhausted, with the particular clarity of someone who had decided they were going to stay conscious and was executing that decision the same way they would execute any other mission objective. His gaze found hers and held. "I'm Mara," she said. "I'm your nurse. Keep your eyes on me." His lips moved. She leaned in. "Real," he said. The word cost him something. "Commander." "Jonas." "Okay, Commander Real. We've got you." She picked up the trauma scissors. "This is going to hurt. Stay with me." She removed the dressing. The bleeding was significant and immediate, and she controlled it with both hands and directed Finch to maintain pressure while she assessed. 2 of the federal agents had taken positions near the bay entrance. The transport medic remained near the doorway, still on the phone, speaking in a register too low to catch. Corbin arrived at 11:59. He came through the double doors and stood at the threshold for the 2 or 3 seconds he always took reading the room, positioning himself, and then he stepped in, and his eyes moved over the federal agents, the military personnel, the man on the gurney, and something shifted in his posture. Not clinical urgency. Something more self-interested. He was deciding what this case meant for him before he'd touched the patient. "Who authorized a federal casualty in my bay without notifying me directly?" he said. "I did," Dolores said from the doorway. "There are protocols for—" "Doctor," Mara said without turning around, "he's 68 systolic and dropping. If you want to run your protocols, do it while you're examining him." A beat of silence. Then Corbin moved to the bedside. He looked at the setup Mara had assembled, the lines running, the blood products hanging, her hands maintaining pressure, Finch positioned correctly and already anticipating her next request. Corbin looked at all of this and did what he always did, registered that things were partially under control, and moved to insert himself as the authority over a situation he had not been present to manage. "Step aside, Voss," he said. "I'll direct from here. I need 60 seconds to—" "I didn't ask what you need." He put his hand on her arm and physically moved her back from the bedside. Not the shove from earlier. More deliberate, more possessive. The motion of a man relocating an object. Finch. Ultrasound. "Let's see what we're working with." Commander Real moved. It was barely a movement. His head turned maybe 10 degrees. His neck was doing work that it shouldn't have had to do given his blood pressure, and the effort showed in the set of his jaw. But his eyes found Mara's face, and they stayed there. And then he said one word in a voice that was nearly gone, but that landed in the room like something dropped from a height. "Sparrow." The word hit the air and the room changed around it. Not dramatically, not with any sound or visible reaction. But something in the atmosphere of the space shifted the way a room shifts when a door opens somewhere and you feel the pressure change before you understand the cause. Finch stopped moving. One of the federal agents took half a step forward and then controlled himself. The transport medic turned away from the doorway and looked at Mara directly for the first time. Corbin looked from the man on the gurney to the nurse beside him. "What did he call you?" Mara said nothing. She was looking at Real's face, at his eyes, at the effort it was costing him to stay present in the room. "Voss." Corbin's voice had a different quality now, not the dismissive authority of before, but something sharper, more alert. "What is that?" Real's eyes hadn't left her face. He was breathing in the shallow, controlled pattern of someone managing significant pain with training rather than medication, and every exhale was a small, deliberate decision. "Don't," he started. Stopped. Breathed. Started again. "Don't let them move you out of this room." "Nobody's moving anyone," Corbin said. "I wasn't talking to you." Real's voice had almost nothing left in it. But the direction was unmistakable. The federal agent who had taken that half step forward, a woman in her mid-40s, with dark hair going gray and the contained stillness of someone who had spent decades in environments where stillness was a professional asset, cleared her throat quietly. She looked at Corbin. "Doctor," she said, "I need you to understand that this patient is under federal protection and that the medical staff managing his care falls under that protection as well. I need everyone who is not essential to this patient's immediate survival to step back." "This is my trauma bay," Corbin said. "Yes, sir." Her voice was completely pleasant. "And I need you to be in it, operating on this man, in the next several minutes. So I need you to stop talking to me and look at your patient." Corbin stared at her. Then he looked at Real. Then he looked at the monitors. 59 systolic. Whatever argument he'd been building evaporated. He turned to the ultrasound himself and took the probe from Finch. Mara stepped back in beside him without being invited and placed her hand on the probe to reposition it, not asking, just doing, and found the image she'd been looking for 30 seconds before he arrived. "Morrison's pouch," she said. "Free fluid. Significant." And she moved the probe 2 centimeters. "That's the hepatic laceration. Right lobe. You need to look at that vascular pattern." Corbin looked at the image. His expression changed in a way that was professional rather than personal. The face of someone whose expertise had been engaged, whether they wanted it to be or not. "He needs a damage control lap," he said. "Yes. Or 2. Or 2 is being prepped. I called it 8 minutes ago." She looked at him directly. "He has maybe 5 minutes of pressure left before we lose the window. You need to go now. I'll bring him up." Corbin held her gaze for a moment, one of those micro-pauses where you could see a man deciding between his ego and his training. His jaw tightened. His training won. He turned and left for the OR. The moment the doors swung shut behind him, the female federal agent moved to Mara's side. Close, speaking just above a breath. "I need 45 seconds of your attention," she said. "He doesn't have 45 seconds to spare," Mara said, not looking up. "I know. So I'll make it 30. The woman paused. "Specialist Voss." Mara's hands kept moving. They didn't stop. But something in the set of her shoulders changed in a way that the agent registered and filed. "I go by Mara," she said. "I know what you go by. I also know what you were, and what you did, and why you left. And I need you to understand that what's happening tonight didn't begin in this hospital." The agent's voice was controlled, precise, each sentence stripped to its minimum. Commander Real was extracted under emergency protocols after his cover was compromised inside a classified program. The people who shot him didn't just find him. They tracked him. And the location they brought him to was not random. Mara checked the pressure readout. 54 systolic. "They chose this hospital," the agent continued. "Why?" It wasn't a question. The flatness of it told the agent that Mara already understood the shape of the answer. She was asking for the confirmation. "Because you're here. They've known for 6 weeks. And tonight isn't just an attempt on Real." Real's hand moved. His right hand, the one on the uninjured side, lifted from the gurney, a small, effortful motion, and found Mara's wrist. His grip was weak. His fingers barely closed. But the intention was there and clear. "Sparrow," he said. Even quieter now. "Almost gone. They're already inside." Mara looked up at the transport medic near the doorway. He was gone. The doorway was empty. She looked at the federal agent. "How many?" she said. "We don't know." The transport team came through the doors to move Real to the OR, and Mara moved with the gurney, her hand maintaining pressure on his shoulder wound, her eyes moving differently now. Not clinically, not looking for symptoms. Looking the way she had trained herself to look in environments where every doorway was a question and every person was an unknown variable. She scanned the hallway as they moved. Fluorescent light. Linoleum. The midnight quiet of a hospital, purposeful, low, the hum of a building that never fully rested. She knew this hallway. She knew every door, every corner, the location of every camera that the facilities team had managed to keep functional. She had walked this specific corridor 1,100 nights in the last 2 years and 8 months. She also knew which camera was dark. Bay 3, supply closet overhang. It had been out for 48 hours. She'd reported it. She'd gotten a ticket number. She hadn't thought about it again. Until now, they reached the elevator. The transport team pressed the call button. Mara looked back down the corridor, back toward the trauma bay they'd just left. Through the small, rectangular windows in the double doors, backlit by the fluorescent overhead, she could see the silhouette of a figure standing inside the bay, standing still, facing the direction they had gone. She had not seen anyone enter that room. She had been watching the door. The elevator arrived with a soft mechanical sound, and the doors opened, and Mara looked at the federal agent over the gurney. The agent had seen it too. Her hand was already moving toward her jacket. And then every light in the corridor went out at once. The darkness was not a power failure. Mara understood that in the first second, before her eyes had adjusted, before anyone in the corridor had spoken, a power failure took the emergency lighting with it for 2 or 3 seconds before the backup generators kicked in and restored the red-tinted auxiliary strips along the baseboards. This darkness was different. The emergency strips stayed dark. The exit signs stayed dark. The elevator interior behind her went black, and the doors which had been opened slid shut with a mechanical finality that suggested the elevator had been recalled to another floor by something other than chance. Only the monitors in the trauma bays remained live. She could see their glow through the rectangular windows of the double doors 40 feet, back down the corridor, green and amber, the vital signs of patients who did not know yet that the around them had changed. Secondary power cut, the federal agent said. Her voice was steady, and she already said something in her hand. They took the auxiliary relay. This wasn't improvised. Real, Mara said. I know. The transport team had stopped moving with the gurney. One of them, a young man who had been calm and professional 30 seconds ago, had gone rigid in the way of someone whose training covered field emergencies, but not this specific configuration of them. The gurney's wheels were locked. Real was on it. His pressure was 54 systolic, and they were no longer moving toward the OR. Mara reached past the transport tech and unlocked the wheels herself. Stairwell, she said, now. OR 2 is on 3. We take the stairs. We don't know what's in the stairwell, the agent said. We know what's in this corridor. Mara looked toward the trauma bay doors. The silhouette she had seen through the small windows was gone. Which was worse. Move. They moved. The stairwell door was 20 feet to the left, and Mara hit it shoulder first without slowing, holding it open while the transport tech navigated the gurney through the frame tight. Not designed for this, the gurney's side rail scraping paint off the doorframe, with a sound like a struck match. The stairwell was dark, except for a single battery-powered emergency light 3 floors up that threw just enough pale illumination to make out the shape of the space without revealing its details. Real the sex made a sound on the gurney, not a word. Just the kind of involuntary sounds that escapes a person when their body is past arguing with them about what it can handle. Stay with me, Mara said. She kept her hand on his shoulder wound, pressure maintained, and used her free hand on the gurney rail as they started up. Jonas, eyes open. A pause, then barely audible, still here. Good. Keep talking. Don't really have a topic. Pick one. He made a sound that might have been a laugh in a different situation. You went civilian, he said. The words came in pieces, fitted between breaths. 3 years. Nobody could find you. People weren't really looking. Some were. She didn't respond to that. They were on the second floor landing, and the going was slow. The gurney wasn't built for stairs, and the transport tech was working hard at the foot end, tilting the frame at an angle that kept the wheels from catching, while Mara and the agent managed the head end together. It was loud. The metal frame transmitted every vibration, and the stairwell amplified everything, which was how Mara heard the door below them open. Not the door they had come through, the door below that one. The ground floor access. The sound was distinct, the hydraulic hiss of a push bar released, the brief intrusion of corridor air into the stairwell pressure, the soft mechanical click of the door closing again afterward. She looked at the agent. The agent had heard it too. She held up 2 fingers, then pointed down. 2 people, at minimum. They were on the 2nd floor landing. Or 2 was on 3. They had 1 more flight. Faster, Mara said quietly. Not loudly. The word went to the transport tech, and he understood it and put his back into it, and the next 45 seconds were the kind of 45 seconds that snays don't feel like 45 seconds while you're inside them. They got the gurney to the 3rd floor landing and through the door and into the OR corridor, where the surgical lights were still running on the OR's independent power circuit, and the sudden brightness after the stairwell dark was almost violent. Corbin was already scrubbed. He was standing outside OR 2, looking at his watch, with an expression that was transitioning from professional impatience to something more complicated when he saw the state of the people coming through the stairwell door. His eyes went from the agent's hand to Mara's face, to Real's vitals on the portable monitor. "Why did you come through the stairs?" he said. "The elevator was compromised," Mara said. "We need to go right now." "What do you mean, compromise?" "Doctor." She met his eyes. "He has minutes, please." Something in the directness of it, or maybe in the agent's presence, the tactical, clothing, the specific quality of controlled urgency in the room reached Corbin in a way that his professional instincts responded to before his ego could intervene. He turned and went through the OR doors without further argument, and the transport team followed with the gurney, and Mara moved to scrub. The agent caught her arm at the scrub sink. "I need you out here," she said. "He needs me in there. Corbin can handle the surgery. You're the only person in this building right now who has the specific skill set for what's coming, and I need you to understand that the threat is active and it's escalating." The agent's hand was firm, but not aggressive. Steady. The grip of someone who had made their assessment and was committed to it. "I have 1 partner in this building, and I lost contact with him 4 minutes ago. I don't know where he is. I don't know how many people came in. What I know is that they didn't come here just to kill Real. They came because Real was a way to get to you." Mara looked at the OR doors. Through the small window, she could see the surgical team moving around Real's gurney, the lights repositioning, the controlled, organized chaos of an emergency opening. "What do they want with me?" she said. Though she could feel the shape of the answer forming in the part of her that had spent 3 years trying to stop forming these kinds of answers. 3 years ago, the operation your unit ran in the cavalry corridor, the agent began. "I know what operation. Then you know what you documented before you left. You know what you gave to your commanding officer before everything fell apart." The agent's voice dropped. "That documentation never made it up the chain. Your CO buried it. And the program that your unit exposed it didn't shut down. It changed names, changed structure, moved assets. And everyone who was present during that operation, and who might still remember what they saw, is either dead, missing, or in this building right now." The corridor was quiet around them. Too quiet. The OR was the only space generating any sound, and it was muffled behind sealed doors. Mara turned off the scrubbed sink. "Who's running it now?" she said. "A man named Danik Pryor." The agent said it carefully, watching Mara's face. "You know that name? You know that name." Mara knew that name. She had not heard it in 3 years, and the hearing of it now did something to the muscles across her shoulders that she deliberately relaxed. One by one. A habit from a previous version of her life. "He sent people here," she said. "He may have come himself. We're not sure." The agent glanced down the corridor. "The person you saw through the trauma bay window. We have a description from the security footage before it went down. Male, approximately 6 foot, tactical clothing under a hospital visitor badge." The badge was forged. They had inside information about the hospital layout. "The camera," Mara said. "Bay 3. It was dark for 2 days." The agent looked at her. "Someone took it out," Mara said. "Not a malfunction. I should have flagged it." "You couldn't have known." "No. But I noticed it, and I filed a report, and I forgot about it." She said it evenly, without self-punishment. Just as a fact that had a consequence and needed to be owned accurately. What do you need from me? I need you to help me find my partner. And I need you to tell me every exit from this floor that isn't on the hospital's public layout. There were 3. One was the surgical waste corridor that ran along the back of the OR suite and connected to the loading dock via a service elevator that required a key code known only to the OR charge nurse and facilities management. One was the utility passage that ran beneath the 3rd floor and accessed the hospital's mechanical room, which had an exterior grate that hadn't been properly sealed since a renovation 4 years prior. The 3rd was a window in the soiled utility room at the north end of the OR corridor that opened onto a maintenance ledge 6 feet above the parking structure roof. Mara knew all 3 because in 2 years and 8 months of night shifts, she had walked every accessible inch of this building. Not because she was planning anything. Not because she'd expected anything like tonight. Simply because she was the kind of person who did not feel comfortable in a space she hadn't fully mapped. Some habits didn't leave when you changed your name and your context. She laid all 3 out for the agent, who listened without writing anything down. When Mara finished, the agent, who had told her name was Solace, just Solace, no rank, no agency, closed her eyes for 2 seconds in a way that was clearly how she memorized spatial information, and then opened them again. The service corridor, Solace said. That's how they'd move real if they got into the OR. The key code is, can you get it? I know one of the OR nurses. Mara was already moving down the corridor toward the OR desk. Tamsin. She's on tonight. She pushed through the anteroom door and found Tamsin at the desk, a small Korean-American woman in her 40s who had the organized calm of someone who had worked surgical nights for 15 years and had stopped being surprised by most things. She looked up at Mara with an expression that suggested Mara's appearance. No scrubs, no OR badge, slightly disheveled from 40 minutes of controlled crisis, registered as unusual, but not yet alarming. Mara? You're not scheduled in... I need the service corridor code, Mara said. Right now. Don't ask me why. Tamsin looked at her for a long moment. Then she wrote 4 numbers on a surgical tape strip and handed it across the desk without saying anything else. The thing about people who had worked difficult jobs for a long time was that they developed a calibrated sensitivity to the difference between a request that required explanation and a request that required trust. Tamsin had made her determination and acted on it, and Mara had 4 seconds to feel grateful before she was back in the corridor. She gave the code to Solace, who relayed it somewhere via an earpiece Mara hadn't noticed until now. My partner's name is Garrett, Solace said. He went to check the ground floor after we arrived and dropped off comms 12 minutes ago. I need to know if he's compromised or if he found something and went dark intentionally. How do I find that out? The hospital security office is on the ground floor, East Wing. If Garrett found something worth going dark for, that's where he'd be. If someone found him first, she stopped. That's also where the evidence would be. Mara understood what she meant by evidence. She didn't ask Solace to elaborate. I'll go, Mara said. You're a nurse. In this building, that's better than a badge. I can walk anywhere, open anything, and nobody questions me until I give them a reason to. She looked at Solace steadily. You need to stay on this floor. Real is in that OR, and if someone comes through the service corridor, you're the only. A sound came from the south end of the corridor. Not loud. Not dramatic. The specific sound of a fire door opening and closing quickly, followed by the kind of silence that comes after someone has moved through a space and is now standing still in it. Both women went still. The south end of the OR corridor had a blind corner. From where they stood, they could not see past it. But the corridor between them and the OR doors was 20 meters of open linoleum with no concealment, and whoever had come through that fire door was now between them and the stairwell. Solace moved her hand toward her jacket. Mara put her hand on Solace's arm. Not forcefully, Just contact. Solis looked at her. Wait, Mara said, barely sound at all. She turned to face the corridor and walked. Not fast, not slow. The purposeful, unhurried walk of a nurse moving between tasks on a surgical floor at midnight, slightly tired, slightly preoccupied, carrying the invisible authority of someone who belonged here completely. She had a pen in her left hand, and she looked at nothing specific as she walked, just the general forward middle distance of a person whose mind was on her next task. A man came around the corner. He was approximately 6 feet tall. Tactical clothing under a zip-front fleece. A hospital visitor badge clipped to his collar. He was moving with the careful, measured pace of someone who was trying to look like he belonged, while running a visual sweep of every doorway he passed. His eyes found Mara, and she watched the half-second calculation happen. In his face, nurse, no threat, classify and dismiss. Excuse me, she said, stopping. Politely, like a nurse who'd noticed a visitor in a restricted area and was about to offer helpful redirection. This is the surgical floor. Visiting hours on this level end at 8. Can I help you find where you're going? He stopped. Looked at her badge. Looked at her face. Running the calculation again, the same one, and arriving at the same conclusion. I'm looking for the waiting area, he said. It's on 2. Take the elevator at the end of this hall, she pointed. Behind her, away from the OR, away from Solis. Do you want me to walk you? A pause. No, I've got it. Thanks. He walked past her. She tracked him in her peripheral vision without turning her head. The way she had been taught to track a person in an environment where turning your head was information you didn't want to give. And she watched him walk 12 steps in the direction she had indicated before he slowed down. He had realized. The elevator at the end of this corridor was the same elevator that had been locked out when the secondary power was cut. It wasn't going anywhere. He turned around. Unkind. Mara was no longer where she had been standing. She was 6 feet to his left, beside the open supply room door, and she looked at him with the same neutral professional expression and said, Changed your mind? He moved fast. She had expected that. She had been hoping for it, actually, because the alternative, him reaching whatever he'd come to the floor for before she could redirect him, was worse. He came at her with the deliberate directness of someone who had decided the pretense was over and efficiency was now the priority. What he had not accounted for was that the woman he was moving toward had spent 4 years in environments where people moved at her with exactly this kind of deliberate directness, and that she had survived those environments, and that survival at that level left marks on a person's reflexes that did not fade with 2 years and 8 months of quiet hospital nights. She used the supply room doorframe as a pivot point and his own momentum to redirect him into the door, jam with enough force that the impact took his legs. It was not clean. Nothing like this was clean. It was loud and it hurt, and she scraped her forearm against the frame and felt it, but he went down, and she put her knee into his lower back in the precise position that made standing back up immediately inadvisable, and she had his wrist at an angle that communicated clearly that further movement would produce a specific and unpleasant consequence. Do not move, she said. Her voice was the same voice she used when she told patients not to move. Calm and absolute. He did not move. Solis was there in 8 seconds, which was how long it took her to cross the corridor at a controlled run. She produced zip ties from somewhere on her person, the practical kind, not decorative, and secured the man's wrists while Mara maintained pressure, and between the two of them, they had him contained and moved into the supply room in under 90 seconds. It was not smooth. Mara's hands were shaking slightly when she stood up. She noticed it and breathed through it, and the shaking stopped. Adrenaline was a system, not a failure. She knew that. Solis checked his pockets and removed a radio, a secondary weapon, and a folded document that she looked at for 3 seconds and then looked at Mara. This is a floor plan, she said, of this hospital. Someone marked the OR location. She turned the paper. And this supply room specifically. Mara looked at the mark on the floor plan. Then she looked at the supply room around her shelves, labeled bins, the particular organized density of a surgical floor supply space. Her eyes moved across the shelving, on the back wall, behind a row of saline bags that had been shifted slightly. Not opened, not disturbed, just moved 2 inches from their original position. There was a device roughly the size of a paperback book with a green indicator light that was currently dark. She crossed the room and looked at it without touching it. "Solus," she said. Solus came and looked. "That's a signal jammer," Mara said. "It's been placed here in the last 48 hours. When it's active, it kills internal comms and cell service in a 40-foot radius." She looked at the indicator light. "It's dark right now because this building's secondary power is out and it's on a standard outlet. When the power comes back, it activates," Solus said. "And anyone trying to call for help from the OR won't be able to." "Someone was going to restore the power," Mara said, "on their timeline, after they were already in position." They looked at each other across the device. "Garrett," Solus said quietly. "If he found this, he might have gone dark to avoid triggering a response before you had backup in position," Mara said. "Or he might not have found it, or someone found him first." Look. Ground floor. Security office. Mara was already moving toward the door. "I'll be faster alone. You stay on this floor and don't let anyone through that service corridor." "Mara." Solus's voice stopped her at the doorway. "Pryor's people, they're not improvising. This is a prepared operation, which means there's a sequence. They cut the power, they placed the jammer, they had the floor plan. There's a next step we haven't identified yet." "I know," Mara said. "Whatever it is, it's already in motion." Mara looked down the corridor toward the OR doors. Through the small window, she could see the surgical lights, steady and bright, completely unaware of anything happening outside. Reel was in there. Corbin was in there, doing the one thing he was genuinely excellent at, and for the moment the OR was a sealed bubble of normalcy in a building that had been systematically taken apart around it. She had put him in that room. She was going to make sure he came out of it. "I'll be back in 10 minutes, she said. The stairwell going down was different from the one going up. She was moving alone this time. No gurney, no agent, just herself and the battery-powered light 3 floors up, and the sound of her own footsteps that she managed to keep almost silent out of a habit she had thought was dead. 2nd floor, 1st floor. She listened at the ground floor stairwell door for 4 seconds before pushing through. The east wing corridor was lit only by emergency strips along the baseboard, which cast long, low shadows and turned everything familiar into something slightly other. The security office was 60 meters down, and around a corner, a room she had been to twice in 3 years once when she'd lost her badge, and once when a patient's family member had become threatening in the waiting room. Both times the office had been staffed by a man named Owusu, who worked nights and spent most of them watching 4 camera monitors and reading paperback thrillers. She moved down the corridor at a pace that was faster than walking, but not running. The nurse's efficient transit speed that didn't attract attention in a hospital setting, even when the person seeing it was on edge. At the corner, she stopped. The security office door was open. It was never open. Owusu kept it closed because the monitor screens were visible from the corridor, and hospital policy prohibited patients from seeing security camera footage. She went around the corner slowly, keeping her shoulder to the wall. Owusu was in his chair. He was conscious. She confirmed it from the doorway. Could see the shallow rise of his breathing. But his head was down and his hands were zip-tied to the chair arms. And there was a pressure cut at his temple that had bled down the side of his face and dried. He had been hit and secured and left, not killed, which told her something about what Pryor's operation was and wasn't willing to do. Not indiscriminate. Targeted. Professional in the specific sense of the word that meant they would not create unnecessary complications unless forced to. She went in. Usu, she said quietly. She put 2 fingers to his neck, pulse strong and regular. Hey, open your eyes. He opened them. It took a moment. He looked at her with the expression of someone locating themselves after a gap. Voss, he said. Stay still. I'm going to look at your head. There were 2 of them, he said immediately. The way people with concussions sometimes produced information before they could produce much else. The brain defaulting to the thing it most urgently needed to communicate. 2 men. They came in maybe 20 minutes ago. One of them sat down at my monitors. Where's the other one? I don't know. I was out after the first. He stopped. Blinked. The cameras. They didn't take the cameras down. They were watching them. Mara looked at the monitors. 3 of the 4 screens were dark, fed by cameras that were no longer live. But the 4th screen, the one covering the OR floor corridor, which ran on the OR's independent circuit, was still active. And on it, moving with unhurried certainty down the 3rd floor corridor that Mara had just left, was a man she did not recognize, but whose posture and movement she understood without needing to. He was not the man she had secured in the supply room. He was not the man who had been watching the monitors. He was a 3rd person, and he was heading toward the OR, and on the screen she could see him stop outside the anteroom door and reach into his jacket for something that was not a visitor badge. She looked at the door she had come through. She looked at the monitor. She looked at Owusu. I need your radio, she said. They took it. She looked at the desk. Landline phone, cord cut. Radio, gone. Owusu's cell phone was on the desk, but she already knew what she would find when she touched the screen. The jammer on the 3rd floor, if the power came back on at any point in the next several minutes, would eliminate cell service in a significant radius. She pressed the home button on his phone anyway. No signal. The power in the building came back on. Not all of it selective, the way a controlled restoration would feel. The corridor lights outside the security office flickered to life. The elevator at the end of the hall chimed softly as its systems restarted. And somewhere in the supply room on the 3rd floor, behind a row of saline bags, a green indicator light blinked on. Mara put the phone down and ran. She was not thinking about the running. She was thinking about the man on the monitor, about the OR anteroom door, about Corbin's hands inside Real's abdomen, about Solus on the 3rd floor corridor, not knowing there was a 3rd operative, about the jammer active now and killing every signal in its radius, about the specific distance between the ground floor and the 3rd floor measured in time and the number of things that could happen in that time. She hit the stairwell door at speed and took the stairs the way she hadn't taken stairs in 3 years fast. No hesitation, not touching the rail, her body finding the old rhythms without being asked. She came through the 3rd floor door, and the corridor was different from how she had left it. Solus was on the floor. Not unconscious. She was moving, trying to get up, one hand braced on the linoleum, and the other arm held at an angle that indicated the shoulder had been impacted. Across from her, the service corridor door was open. And the anteroom to OR 230 feet further down was also open ajar, slightly. The way a door looked when someone had gone through it in a hurry. Someone had gotten into the OR. Mara crossed to Solus in 8 steps and got a hand under her arm. How many? One got past me. Maybe 30 seconds ago. Solus's jaw was tight with something she was controlling. He had a taser. I didn't see it until she stopped. Real. He's going for real. Mara looked at the anteroom door. She looked at Solus. She looked at her own hands. A nurse's hands, bare, without anything in them. And she walked through the anteroom door into the surgical suite. The anteroom smelled like antiseptic and recycled air and the particular chemical sharpness of surgical prep, and Mara moved through it without pausing, past the scrub sinks, past the rack of surgical gowns, and pushed through the inner door into OR2. The room was wrong, in 3 places simultaneously. The scrub tech, a young man named Dario, who worked nights and always had a podcast playing in his left ear during prep, was on the floor beside the instrument table. Not moving. The instrument table itself had been partially displaced. A tray of protractors knocked to the floor, the clatter of it still seeming to hang in the room's memory. And at the head of the surgical table, standing between the anesthesia machine and the wall with one hand on the gas delivery line and the other holding a secondary weapon, pointed at the back of Corbin's head, was a man in surgical scrubs that fit him, the way scrubs fit someone who had put them on very recently over other clothing. Corbin had not moved. His hands were still inside Reel's open abdomen, packed gauze visible between his gloves, his posture the rigid stillness of someone who had made a rapid and correct assessment that movement was currently inadvisable. The anesthesiologist, a compact woman named Dr. Adeze Obi, whom Mara had worked with on 3 prior trauma cases, was against the back wall, with her hands raised and her eyes moving between the weapon and the monitors with the measured calculation of someone who was terrified and functional at the same time. Reel was on the table. His chest was moving. The monitors showed a pressure of 61/40, which was low but sustainable for another window of time that was not infinite. The man at the head of the table had not looked at the door when Mara came through it, which told her he had heard it and decided she was not a threat worth redirecting his attention for, which told her he had looked at her and made the same calculation the man in the corridor had made 40 minutes ago. He saw a nurse. "Close the door," he said. His voice was accented faintly, Eastern European, controlled. He didn't look at her when he said it. He was watching Corbin's hands and stand against that wall. Mara closed the door. She did not go to the wall. "The gas line," she said. "If you adjust that delivery, this man dies on the table. That's not what you were sent here for." Now he looked at her. His eyes moved from her face to her badge, to her hands, the automatic assessments, same sequence as the corridor. And he made the same determination. Recategorized her as low priority and looked back at Corbin. "He's not supposed to die on the table," the man said. "He's supposed to wake up somewhere else. He's supposed to wake up somewhere else, which means the surgeon keeps his hands exactly where they are and closes what he opened." And the nurse, he said the word with the flat dismissiveness of someone who had already decided what the word meant, stands against that wall and does not complicate the next 10 minutes. "You can't move a man in damage control surgery," Mara said. "If you pull him off this table right now, he'll bleed out before you get him to wherever you're taking him. His hepatic vein is partially repaired. His pressure is 61. You need another 20 minutes of surgical time minimum before he's stable enough to tolerate transport." A pause. The man looked at her again, longer this time. "You know what a hepatic vein is," he said. "I'm a nurse." "Nurses don't usually. I work trauma," she said. "I've been in this building for 3 years. I've assisted in over 200 emergency surgeries. The man on that table has a grade 4 liver laceration and a compromised inferior vena cava tributary that your surgeon," she nodded at Corbin, "is currently managing with packing and a vascular clamp. If that clamp moves in the next 15 minutes without proper sequential release, he throws a PE and he's dead. And then you go back to whoever sent you here and explain why the asset you were paid to deliver is dead because you didn't listen to the nurse." The room was very quiet. Corbin had not moved. Obi had not moved. On the floor, Dario was breathing. Mara had confirmed it in her peripheral vision, the slow rise of his chest, unconscious but alive. The man at the head of the table was running a different calculation now. She could see it in his face. The recategorization happening in real time, the low priority assessment being revised upward with some friction. He did not lower the weapon, but his attention had redistributed. 10 minutes, he said. 20, she said. Minimum. 15. And you don't move from that spot. I need to be at the table, she said. He needs active monitoring. If his pressure drops below 50, the surgeon needs to know immediately to adjust the packing. You can watch me from there. I'm not going anywhere. Another pause. Longer. He looked at Corbin. She accurate? He said. Corbin's voice came out controlled and flat, the voice of a man who had packaged his fear temporarily inaccessible. Yes. The man gestured with the weapon go ahead. Mara moved to the table. She positioned herself on Real's right side, where the monitoring equipment gave her access to the pressure readout, the pulse ox, and the IV lines. She kept her hands visible on the table rail. She looked at the monitors. She looked at Real's face. His eyes were closed under the anesthesia, but his color was slightly better than it had been. Corbin had made progress. Whatever she might think of him as a person, and the packing was holding the worst of the bleeding. The vascular clamp Obi had placed on the tributary line was positioned correctly. They had maybe 18 minutes of genuine surgical window before the packed gauze would need to be reassessed at. She looked at the instrument tray on her side of the table. The partial one. The main tray had been displaced when the man came through. There were still instruments on it, organized, sterile draped, the way surgical instrument sets were always laid. Her eyes moved across them with the particular neutrality of someone who was not looking at anything specifically. Then she looked at Obi. Obi was still against the wall. Her hands were raised, but her eyes were active, moving, tracking. The eyes of someone who had not stopped thinking. Mara held her gaze for 1 second and looked down at the IV line running from Real's left arm to the bag hanging on the pole beside Obi's position. Then she looked back at the monitors. Obi lowered her eyes to the IV line. Mara watched the man at the head of the table in her peripheral vision. He had repositioned slightly, angling to keep both Corbin and the door in his line of sight, which meant his back was now partially to the wall, and his angle on Obi's position was less direct than it had been. "Pressure's dropping," Mara said. Her voice was level and clinical. 73 to 58 in the last 90 seconds. "Doctor, I need you to repack the posterior margin." Corbin's hands moved. Steady, deliberate, the hands of a surgeon operating under conditions that had no protocol because no protocol had imagined them. "I see it," he said. "Obi." Mara kept her voice the same clinical, task-focused, the voice of a nurse in a normal surgical environment, directing a normal team. "I need you to push the fluid rate up. Lined 2, the roller clamp." Obi moved. She moved toward the IV pole. The roller clamp was on the line that ran from the second saline bag, and she reached for it, and her hand went to the line, and she adjusted the roller clamp. And while she was doing it, while the man's eyes tracked her movement and categorized it as medical and non-threatening, her other hand, below his sight line, found the secondary port on the IV tubing and did something small and specific that Mara had told her to do with a look and 2 pieces of visible information and the professional shorthand of 2 people who had worked enough emergencies together to communicate in compression. She pushed the port cap. The man didn't see it. He was watching Corbin's hands. "Rates up," Obi said. She went back to the wall. Mara watched the monitors. Watched Real's face. Watched the man at the head of the table and the specific way his attention distributed itself across the room. 60% on Corbin, 20% on the door, 10% on Obi, 10% on Mara, which was the breakdown of a man who had done his threat assessment and felt confident in it. 40 seconds passed. The man shifted his weight. A small movement 1 foot repositioning, a micro-adjustment of his center of gravity. Not alarming. The kind of thing a person did when they had been standing in one position, under tension, for several minutes. Then he shifted his weight again. He looked down at his feet. Then back up at Corbin. Then at Mara, with an expression that had something new in it. Not alarm yet, but the precursor to alarm, the moment when a person's body is telling them something their mind hasn't fully processed. "What did you do?" he said. Not a question. The beginning of a question that hadn't finished forming. "His pressure is stabilizing," Mara said. "That's what I did. I told Obi to push fluids." He looked at Obi, then at the IV pole. Then back at Mara. What Obi had pushed into the secondary port was not in the saline bag. It was in the emergency medication kit that lived on the anesthesia cart beside her position in a pre-drawn syringe that every OR anesthesiologist staged before every procedure as standard protocol, a sedative induction agent that administered through a secondary port at the correct dose into an already established IV line would reach its target in approximately 90 seconds. The man was large. The dose Obi had estimated by sight was conservative. It would not put him under. It would not drop him. What it would do in the next 30 to 45 seconds was degrade his fine motor coordination and slow his reaction time by a margin that in most situations would be imperceptible, and in this specific situation would be exactly enough. Mara had counted to 63. She picked up the instrument from the tray. It was a white laner retractor, a self-retaining surgical instrument, 6 inches long, with 2 sharp prongs at one end and a ratcheted handle at the other. Not a weapon, not designed as one. But a 6-inch metal instrument with prongs was a 6-inch metal instrument with prongs, regardless of its intended purpose. And the distance between Mara's position at the table and the man at the head of it was 9 feet, and she covered 9 feet before he processed that she had moved. She did not hit him with the retractor. She used it to redirect the weapon, a sharp controlled deflection at the wrist, the angle chosen to drive the barrel toward the ceiling, and away from the table, away from Real, away from Corbin, who had flattened himself against the table instinctively. The weapon discharged. The sound in the enclosed space of the OR was enormous, a concussive pressure that hit the eardrums and the sternum simultaneously, and the round went into the ceiling tile and dropped a small cascade of white debris. Then Mara was inside his reach. What followed was not clean, and it was not precise, and her elbow hit the corner of the anesthesia machine during the second sequence of movement, and she felt it immediately, a deep bone impact pain that would be a significant bruise by morning, and that she noted and filed and ignored. He was larger than her by 60 pounds, and he recovered faster than the medication alone would have allowed, which meant her window was short, and she could not afford to trade with him. She used the window she had, the degraded fine motor, the surprise, the close quarters that eliminated the reach advantage, to get his weapon arm into a position from which discharging it again would do him more damage than her. And she communicated that to him, physically, clearly, and he understood it. He dropped the weapon. It hit the OR floor with the specific clatter of metal on tile. Corbin came around the table and put his full weight on the man from behind. Not tactically, not trained. Just the brute pragmatic physics of a large man who had made a decision to be useful. And between the two of them, they got the operative on the floor, and Mara held his wrist at the angle she had learned in a training context that felt very far away and very close at the same time. She was breathing hard. Her elbow was sending significant signals. She looked at Obi. "Get Solis," she said. "3rd floor corridor." "Go." Obi went. Corbin was kneeling on the operative's back with an expression that Mara had never seen on his face before. Something stripped of the professional veneer, something raw and shaken and real. He looked at her across the man between them. "What are you?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm your scrub nurse," she said. "Get back to the table. His clamp needs to come off in 11 minutes, or we lose the vein." Corbin stared at her. "Doctor." Her voice did not change. 11 minutes. He got up and went back to the table. Solis arrived 4 minutes later with her shoulder in a position that indicated she had reset it herself at some point in the corridor, which was something Mara added to the list of things she would address when the list became addressable. Solis zip-tied the operative with the efficiency of someone performing a familiar task, checked him for additional equipment, finding a second radio, a tactical blade, and a phone with a lock screen she didn't attempt to bypass, and then looked at the ceiling where the round had gone through, and back at Mara. "3rd one," she said. "3rd one I've seen," Mara said. "I don't know if there are more." "My partner," Solis said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something beneath it that wasn't. "Garrett. He's still security office. Ground floor. Owusu's chair. He was secured when I was there, but he was breathing and his pulse was strong." She looked at Solis. "I didn't have time to cut him loose." I'm sorry. Solis closed her eyes for 2 seconds. Opened them. Okay, she said. The word contained a significant amount of compressed information relief, a residual fear being stood down, the reorganization of priorities. Okay, he's fine. We'll get him. We have a larger problem, Morris said. Prior. These 3 are not the operation. They're the preparation. 3 people in a regional hospital with a floor plan and a jammer and a sedation agent in a 3rd-floor supply room. That's advanced work. The actual operation is something else. Mara looked at the operative on the floor, who was conscious but not going anywhere. She looked at the radio Solis had removed from him. Can you read the channel? Solis looked at the radio. It's encrypted. Give it to me. Solis handed it over. Mara looked at the frequency display and the channel indicator and the specific configuration of the encryption toggle model she recognized because she had used an earlier iteration of the same family in a context she rarely allowed herself to think about. She pressed the monitor function, which the encrypting party had not disabled because monitoring didn't transmit, and listened. Static. Then, underneath the static, the compressed rhythmic quality of encrypted transmission. Not intelligible, but present. Someone was talking on this channel. Someone nearby. They're still active, she said. Pryor is still communicating with someone. In the building? Close to it. She looked at the window on the north wall of the OR, the same window that looked out over the parking structure that she had mentioned to Solis an hour ago. The maintenance ledge, the unsealed grate, the 6-foot drop to the parking roof. She crossed to it and looked out. The parking structure was 3 levels. From the 3rd-floor OR window, she was looking down at the top level, open air, lit by the facility's sodium lights that had come back online when the selective power restoration had run. There were vehicles on the top level 12, 15 most of them, the unremarkable civilian cars of night shift hospital staff. And at the far end of the structure, backed against the perimeter of the structure, backed against the perimeter wall with its lights off, was a black cargo van with no visible license plate and a single figure standing beside it, facing the hospital, with something pressed to his ear. Mara looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she looked at the radio in her hand. Pressed the monitor function again. The transmission rhythm matched the movement of his mouth. He's in the structure, she said. He's coordinating from outside. Solis was beside her. She looked at the figure. Her hand moved toward her jacket. Too far, Mara said. You'd need a rifle, and if he sees movement at this window, he runs. She looked at the layout of the parking structure, the entry ramp, the stairwells, the pedestrian exit on the south side. He doesn't know 3 of his people are down. He's still expecting to receive the asset. Real. Through the maintenance ledge. That was the extraction route. Take the patient through the supply room window, down to the parking roof, into the van. Clean, no hospital exits, no cameras once the power was cut. She looked at the van. He's waiting. Solis looked at her with the expression of someone revising an assessment in real time. You figured that out from. The floor plan had the OR marked and the supply room marked, and nothing else on the north side of the building. The supply room is the only space with direct ledge access. It's the only route that makes sense if you're trying to extract a surgical patient without going through a lobby. If we let him keep waiting, Solis said slowly, he doesn't know the operation has failed. He stays in place, and eventually he calls the radio, and nobody answers, Mara said, which gives him maybe 2 minutes before he decides to cut and run. She looked at the operative on the floor, at the radio, unless someone answers. Solis looked at the radio, looked at Mara, looked back at the window. Can you use that? She said. Mara looked at the encrypted channel indicator. The transmission protocol it used was a variant she had not operated in 3 years, and could not guarantee she could replicate accurately over an encrypted channel without the device's own encoding. What she could do was press the transmit function and produce something static partial signal, a fragmented transmission that might read as equipment malfunction rather than silence. "I can buy time," she said. "Not much. 5 minutes. Maybe less. 5 minutes is enough if I can get to the parking structure south entrance." Solis was already moving away from the window. "Keep him on that channel." She was out the OR door before Mara could respond. Mara looked at the radio. She looked at the figure by the van. She thought about the specific mechanics of what she was about to do, and decided not to think about them further, and pressed the transmit key. What came out of the van side radio, she couldn't hear it from here, could only track his reaction made. The figure pulled the device from his ear and looked at it. He pressed something on his end. She transmitted again, the same degraded partial burst. He said something into his radio. She watched his lips. He was irritated, not alarmed. The irritation of a man whose equipment was malfunctioning at an inconvenient moment, not the alarm of a man who had realized something was wrong. He lowered the radio, looked at the hospital building, and turned back to the van. "Man." Mara exhaled. Behind her, Corbin said, "Pressure's holding at 67. The vein repair is. I think it's going to hold." She turned. He was at the table, both hands working, his voice carrying something she had not heard in it before. The quiet, unguarded uncertainty of a man reporting to someone he had decided to trust. "Good," she said. "The bleeding at the posterior margin. I've got it controlled. I think." He paused. "I've never operated under. I've never done this." "You're doing it," she said. "You told me to get back to the table." "You got back to the table." He was quiet for a moment. His hands kept moving. "Who are you?" he said. Not the version of the question he'd asked earlier. Not the shocked, stripped version. Something more considered. Like he genuinely wanted to know. "Right now, I'm the person watching your patient's monitors," she said. "That's enough." She looked back at the window. The figure by the van was on the radio again. She pressed transmit. He lowered the radio again, looked at it, put it away in his jacket. Then he reached into the van and came out with something long and flat, that he rested against his forearm, and she recognized the shape of it from 30 meters away and across a parking structure in sodium light, dark. The case he had pulled from the van was not a radio case. It was a rifle case. And he had turned toward the hospital and was opening it with the precise, unhurried movements of a man who had revised his operational plan and arrived at a new one. And she had approximately 45 seconds before he had something assembled and ready and aimed at a third-floor window where the light was on and 2 people were visible. She dropped below the window ledge. "Get down," she said to Corbin. Flat and immediate. He looked at her. Down now. Behind the table. He didn't ask. He went down. She low-crawled to the OR door and came up against the wall beside the door frame and looked at the figure in the parking structure, visible, now, only from an angle that did not put her in the window's center. He had the case open. She could see him lifting the components. She needed Solis at that south entrance in the next 60 seconds. She looked at her own hands. No radio. She had left it at the window. She looked at it across the room 8 feet of open floor space, directly in the window's line. She looked at Dario still on the floor, beside the displaced instrument, table breathing, not conscious, in no immediate danger from anything except the next 60 seconds if this went the direction it was going. She looked at the door. She looked at the window. Solis was somewhere between the third-floor corridor and the parking structure south entrance, moving as fast as she could move. With a shoulder, she had reset herself, without comms, without backup, through a building that still had at least one unknown variable somewhere in it. And the man in the parking structure had stopped lifting components. He was looking at the window, directly at the window. Not at the center of the frame where the light was, at the left margin, the edge where Mara's shoulder was visible by 2 inches against the wall. He had seen her, and his hands had stopped moving. Mara pulled her shoulder back from the window edge, and the first round came through the glass, half a second later. It did not come through where she had been standing. It came through the lower left quadrant of the window frame, which told her he had aimed for center mass, at the position he had last seen her, and she had already dropped 6 inches below that position when he fired. The glass did not shatter the way. Glass shattered in films. It crazed outward in a controlled pattern. From the impact point, a spiderweb of fractured panes held together by the safety laminate, and a second round came through 8 inches to the right of the first, before the echo of the first had finished bouncing off the OR walls. He was adjusting. Mara was already moving low, fast, across the floor toward the instrument table that Corbin had gone behind, covering the distance in a crawl that put the surgical table between her and the window line. She came up against the table base and stayed there, her back to the steel, listening to the specific sound of the room, the monitors, still running, still alarming softly. Real's pressure holding at 67, and the particular silence of Corbin, 3 feet to her left, pressed flat against the floor with his gloved hands held up instinctively, still sterile, still trying not to contaminate the field even now. "He's going to come through that window," Corbin said. His voice was very controlled for a man lying on an OR floor in a hospital that had turned into something else entirely. "He's not," Mara said. "He's positioned 3 levels down on the parking structure. The ledge access from this building is 12 feet above his line of fire. He can't elevate the rifle enough to cover the window at that angle from where he's standing." She calculated it. As she said it, running the geometry, window height, parking structure roof line, distance, the physics of elevation angle. "He's trying to drive us out of this room. He wants us to move." "Why?" "Because if we stay in here and Solis gets to the south entrance, he's trapped between a building and a perimeter wall with a disassembled rifle and no exit vehicle." Corbin processed this. Then, "And if Solis doesn't get there?" Mara didn't answer that. A third round came through the window, higher this time, punching through the upper frame and embedding somewhere in the OR ceiling. He was working the pattern low, right? High, the systematic probing of a trained shooter trying to establish where in the room the targets had relocated. The surgical light above the table took a fragment, and one of its bulbs blew with a soft pop, reducing the overhead illumination by a third. Real was still on the table. Mara looked up at him from the floor, at his face, slack under anesthesia, at the draping that covered his open abdomen, at the IV lines running into both arms and the monitor leads taped to his chest. He was 3 feet above her and completely exposed, and there was nothing she could do about it from the floor except stay low, and at kip table between the window and herself, and trust that a man with a rifle on a parking structure in February was not going to put a round through a surgical patient by accident when his objective was to recover that patient alive. She was trusting a lot right now. A 4th round came through, and then silence. Not the silence of someone who had stopped. The silence of someone who had made a decision and was acting on it. She had been in enough situations where shooting stopped to know the difference between a pause and a conclusion, and this was neither. This was the specific silence of a man who had switched strategies. She heard the maintenance ledge grate. It was a sound she would not have recognized 2 hours ago. Now she knew it precisely, the scrape of an improperly sealed exterior grate being pushed inward, the brief mechanical resistance, the give. The sound traveled through the building's exterior wall and arrived in the OR as something small and definitive, and it told her that the man in the parking structure had abandoned the rifle and was climbing. He had found the 3rd access route. "He's coming in through the supply room," she said. Corbin looked at her. The supply room is 40 feet down the corridor. Through the anteroom. She was already on her feet, moving, staying below the lower edge of the window line until she was far enough from it that the angle no longer mattered. "Stay on the floor. Don't move until I come back. You're not going out there. Watch his monitors." She looked at Corbin directly, giving him the one instruction that would keep him functional and focused. "If his pressure drops below 50, you get back on that table regardless of anything else happening in this building." "Understood?" Corbin looked at her. His jaw was tight. Something in his face was different from the man who had shoved her against a supply cart. Not transformed, not redeemed, just temporarily stripped of the protective layering he had built over years of being the most important person in every room. What was underneath it was someone who was capable of being told what to do and doing it. Understood, he said. She went through the OR door. The corridor was dim. The selective ration had returned the corridor lights, but at reduced capacity. And what had been fluorescent bright was now a flattened, yellowish half-light that threw shadows in the wrong directions. The anteroom door to OR2 was closed behind her. The supply room was at the north end, 40 feet away, and the door to it was closed, but not latched. She'd see the gap at the frame, a centimeter of darkness, where the door had not fully engaged. She had closed that door. She was almost certain she had closed that door. She moved down the corridor at a pace that did not rush, which was a discipline rather than a comfort, because rushing produced sound, and sound was information she could not afford to give away in the next 90 seconds. The elbow she had hit against the anesthesia machine was a steady, insistent presence at the edge of her attention. She moved her arm through its range of motion, painful but functional, no structural compromise, and filed it. The supply room door moved. Not much. Half an inch. The gap widened and then stopped, as if someone inside had shifted their weight and the door had responded to the change in floor pressure. Mara stopped 6 feet from the door. She looked at the corridor around her. The wall to her left was smooth, no cover, no alcove. The wall to her right had a linen cart parked against it, a standard hospital linen cart, 4 feet tall, wire-framed, loaded with folded surgical draping. Not cover in any meaningful tactical sense, concealment at best, and marginal concealment at that. She looked at the supply room door. She looked at the linen cart. She thought about the geometry of the supply room. The layout she had memorized during 2 years of night shifts, shelving on 3 walls, narrow central aisle, the saline bags on the back wall, the single work surface on the left side near the door, the window on the north wall that opened onto the maintenance ledge. A man coming in through that window would have 2 feet of ledge and then a 30-inch drop to the supply room floor, and the windowsill would be behind him when he landed, which meant he would be facing the door, which meant when the door opened, he would see whatever came through it. Unless something came through it at a height and angle that did not correspond to what he was expecting to see. She looked at the linen cart again. She put both hands on the cart's frame. The supply room door opened fully, and the man came through it, moving fast entry velocity, committed forward motion, the way you moved when you had accepted that speed was more protective than caution in a confined space. He was in the corridor, and turning before the door had fully swung, a compact man with dark clothing and something in his right hand that was not the rifle, something shorter, the tactical decision of a man who had ditched the long gun for close quarters. And his eyes found the corridor and processed it, and in the half-second that processing took, Mara drove the linen cart into him from the left. It was not elegant. The cart was heavy, and the wheels caught on a seam in the linoleum, and the angle was 2 degrees off what she'd intended, and the impact was enough to knock him sideways rather than fully down, which was not what she needed. He hit the opposite wall and used it, bouncing off rather than absorbing the impact, and the thing in his right hand, and she was came up, and she was inside his reach before it could extend. What was the only place she could afford to be. She had his right wrist. He was stronger than she was. That was a fact, and she had no illusions about it, and she did not try to match it. She used the wrist lock not to hold him, but to redirect 45 degrees, downward and across his body's centerline, which put him off balance rather than controlled, and she used that off balance to drive his right shoulder into the wall with her own body weight behind it. The impact dislodged something in his grip, not the weapon. She could still feel his fingers on it through her grip on his wrist, but his certainty. The fraction of a second where his priority reorganized from offense to physical stability. She took the fraction. She got 2 fingers on the weapon and twisted it in a direction that his wrist did not accommodate, and his grip broke. The weapon hit the floor. He hit her. The left hand, coming across. She saw it and got her forearm up, but the deflection was partial, and it caught her jaw on the left side with enough force to put white light at the edges of her vision and put her against the corridor wall. She tasted something metallic. She stayed on her feet by putting her shoulder into the wall and using it. He was going for the weapon on the floor. She stepped on it. He looked up at her from the crouch. She looked down at him. They were both breathing hard. The corridor was quiet around them in the particular way that spaces went quiet when 2 people were in them, and both of them were deciding. "It's over," she said. Her jaw ached when she talked, and she did not try to hide that it ached. "Your other 3 people are secured. Your extraction vehicle is still in the parking structure, and there are federal agents on their way to it right now." She did not know for certain that last part was true. She was stating it as truth because the alternative, that Solis had not made it, that the man in the parking structure was still free and armed, was not a variable she could work with. "You have one option left." He looked at the weapon under her foot. "I wouldn't," she said. He looked at her face, at whatever was in it. Not anger, not fear, just the flat, professional certainty of someone who had made her determination and was not going to revise it. He sat down on the corridor floor and put his hands on his knees. Solis came back up the stairwell 11 minutes later. She came through the door at the south end of the corridor and walked toward Mara with the controlled stride of someone who was hurting and not prioritizing it, her left arm held slightly away from her body in the way of a managed shoulder. Behind her came a man Mara had not seen before, large, dark-skinned, with a cut above his right eye that had been pressed shut with surgical tape, and the expression of someone who had been tied to a chair and was processing the gap between that experience and his current one. Garrett. "He was in the security office," Solis said. She looked at the man on the corridor floor, at the weapon under Mara's foot, at the linen cart displaced against the wall, at the state of Mara's jaw. She did not comment on any of it. "Pryor ran," she said. Mara looked at her. "He saw me coming through the south entrance, and he ran. Left the van, left the rifle case, left everything." Solis's voice had a specific quality, the flat, controlled tone of someone reporting a failure they were not yet finished with. "He had a secondary vehicle on the street behind the structure. We didn't know about it. By the time I got through the perimeter, he was gone." Mara looked at the ceiling. She looked at the wall. She breathed through her nose and let the specific feeling of that information move through her and settle somewhere she could carry it. "He left the van," she said. "Yes. What's in it?" Solis was quiet for a moment. "We haven't fully processed it yet. But there were documents in the cargo area. Physical documents, not digital. Pre-printed operational briefs, asset profiles, extraction protocols. The kind of thing you print because you're not putting it on a network." She paused. "Your name is in them. Your full service record. Your deployment history. Your call sign. Where you've been for the last 3 years." Another pause. And a list of other names. People from your unit. People from the operation 3 years ago. Mara was quiet. "Some of those people," Solis said carefully, "are already marked." "Marked how?" Solis looked at her with the direct, steady gaze of someone who had decided that a person who had managed this night deserved accurate information delivered without softening. "Terminated, prior to tonight. This wasn't just an operation to recover real and neutralize you. This was the last step in a cleanup that's been running for 3 years." The corridor was very still. Mara thought about the operation in the Kaveri corridor. She thought about the people who had been there, the unit, the team, the men and women she had kept alive through a night that shouldn't have been survivable. She thought about the documentation she had put together afterward, the careful and specific account of what she had seen and what she believed it meant, the report she had given to her commanding officer, with the conviction that it would go up the chain and become the thing that stopped what she had witnessed from continuing. She thought about what Solis had just told her. "How many?" she said. "We don't have a full count yet." "How many?" she said again. "4 confirmed before tonight." Solis held her gaze. "2 more are currently unaccounted for. We're trying to locate them." Mara looked at the floor. She looked at her hands. She breathed. "Pryor ran," she said. "Yes, he left evidence behind. A significant amount. The documents alone are solely stopped. It's substantial. Enough to open a federal investigation. Enough that people are going to have to answer for things that have been unanswered for 3 years. But he's gone. For now." Mara looked at Solis. "He knows I'm here. He knows I'm alive. He knows his operation failed, and he knows I was part of why." She said it not as a complaint, as an inventory. "He's going to recalibrate. Yes, which is why we need to move you. I'm not leaving this hospital until Real is out of surgery." Solis looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," she said. The next 2 hours had a different texture from everything that had preceded them. Not calm. Nothing about the next 2 hours was calm. Federal agents arrived at Harbor View General at 1:47 in the morning, which was 29 minutes after Solis managed to restore external comms by physically removing the jammer from the supply room and dropping it on the OR corridor floor. They came in through 3 entrances simultaneously and moved through the building with the systematic efficiency of people executing a protocol that had been waiting for authorization. And the authorization had clearly arrived, because there were a lot of them, and they knew exactly where to go. Mara watched them process the building from the nurse's station. On 3, sitting in a chair that someone had produced for her without her asking, Tamsin, she thought it had the particular thoughtfulness of Tamsin, with an ice pack against her jaw and a cup of coffee. She was not drinking going cold beside her. Her elbow had been looked at by Finch, who had found her in the corridor with an expression that contained 18 different questions he had compressed into the professional query of whether she needed medical attention, and she had let him examine the elbow because he needed to do something useful, and the elbow needed to be examined. No fracture. Significant contusion. He had wrapped it and told her to elevate it, and then stood for a moment, looking at her with the compressed 18 questions still visible in his face before she said, "Go check on your patients, Finch." And he went. Corbin came out of OR 2 at 2:15. He had changed out of his surgical gown and was in scrubs, and he walked down the corridor and stopped in front of the nurse's station and looked at Mara sitting in the chair. He was a large man, and he filled the doorway, and he looked tired in the specific way that surgeons looked tired after procedures that had demanded things they weren't certain they had. Not the tiredness of physical exertion, but the tiredness of sustained, high-stakes concentration finally released. "He's closed," he said. "Vein repair held. Pressure's been stable at 78 for the last 40 minutes. He'll need at least 2 more operations over the next week, but..." He stopped. "He's going to make it." Mara exhaled slowly. "I thought you should hear it," Corbin said. "Thank you." He stayed in the doorway. There was something he wanted to say, and he was working toward it in the way of a man who did not have much practice at this particular kind of statement. She did not help him. She waited. "Earlier tonight," he said. He gestured vaguely, at the corridor, the hospital, the entire preceding 4 hours. "I put my hands on you. In the trauma bay. That was." He stopped. "I've done things like that before. I've told myself it wasn't what it was. It was what it was." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to accept that as sufficient," he said. "It's not sufficient. I just need to say it." "I heard you," she said. It was not forgiveness and it was not absolution. And he seemed to understand that, because he nodded once and did not ask for more. He looked at the OR door behind him. "She's a good anesthesiologist," he said. "OB. I've never really. I don't think I've told her that." "You should," Mara said. He nodded again and walked back toward the OR. Solis found her at 3 a.m., with a different expression than she'd worn for the preceding several hours. Something less contained something that suggested this information she was carrying had weight she'd been managing since it arrived. She pulled a chair from the adjacent desk and sat down across from Mara and put a tablet on the station surface between them, with a document open on its screen. "We found Garrett's initial report," she said. "He sent it before they took his radio. It went through on the hospital's landline relay before that was cut." She looked at the tablet. "He found the van before I did. He photographed the documents in the cargo bay." She turned the tablet toward Mara, including this. Mara looked at the screen. It was a personnel file. She recognized the format military, classified tier, the specific layout of a record that lived in systems accessible only through clearance levels that most people in uniform never reached. The photograph in the upper right corner was hers. Younger by 4 years, in uniform, with an expression that was not a smile and not a frown, but the particular neutral readiness of someone who had been told to look at a camera and had complied without interest. The name at the top of the file was not Mara Voss. "They've had this the whole time," Solis said. "Your real file, not the civilian record you built. Your actual service record, your deployment history, your call sign, your commendations." She paused. "Your official record was sealed after you left. What you didn't know was that it was sealed by someone inside the program, not to protect you, to protect them. If your record was sealed, you couldn't access it. You couldn't use it to corroborate anything. You couldn't prove you were who you were." Mara looked at the photograph. "The commendations in there," Solis continued, "there are 4 of them. One is classified at a level that requires specific authorization to access. It relates to the Kaveri operation." She looked at Mara. "The lives you documented saving that night are in the record. The actions you took, all of it." She paused. "The record also contains your commanding officer's notation that the report you submitted was received and reviewed." "And buried," Mara said. "And buried," Solis said. "Which is now documented evidence of a conspiracy to suppress a material report. Which is," she measured her words carefully, "going to be a significant problem for several people who currently hold significant positions." Mara looked at the photograph for another moment. Then she looked at Solis. "Will Pryor be found?" she said. "Yes," Solis said. It was not a reassurance. It was a statement about operational intent, delivered with the confidence of someone who had resources and the authorization to use them. "He made a mistake tonight. He ran and he left a van full of documentation. People in his position, people who have operated covertly for as long as he has. They make a life out of not leaving things behind. Tonight he left things behind. That changes the scope of what we can do. He'll know that. Yes, he'll know we have the documents, and he'll know what they contain. Which means he'll know that running is no longer a maintenance operation. It's a survival operation. And people running for survival make more mistakes." Solis folded her hands on the table. "He will be found. I can't give you a timeline, but I can tell you it is the active priority of the people I work for, and those people are thorough." Mara looked at her hands on the station surface. A nurse's hands. She had thought of them that way for 3 years, and they were still that, would always be that, but they were also other things that she had not looked at directly in a long time. "The names on that list," she said. "The ones who are unaccounted for. The 2 from the unit. We have people trying to locate them. I want to know when you find them. I'll make sure you're contacted. Not contacted. I want to know." She looked at Solis. "Those are people I worked with. Whatever you find, I want to know." Solis held her gaze. "Okay," she said. "You'll know." At 4 in the morning, they moved Reel to the ICCU. Mara walked alongside the gurney for the length of the corridor before the ICU doors, which was not her assigned territory. It was an ER nurse, not ICU, and the handoff was between OB and the intensive care team. But nobody told her to stop, and she did not stop. She walked beside him, and she looked at his face, and at the monitors, and at the IV lines running clean, and the pressure reading at 81 systolic, which was not good, but was survivable, which was the operative word. In the ICU antrum, while the team transferred monitoring equipment, Real opened his eyes. Not fully. A partial opening. The eyes of someone coming through the heavy fog of surgical anesthesia, registering light and shape before registering meaning. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the equipment. And then, slowly his head turned, and he found her standing against the anteroom wall. He looked at her for a long time. "You stayed," he said. His voice was nearly nothing dry, remote, the voice of a man, a significant distance from full consciousness. "I didn't go anywhere," she said. Sparrow. The call sign came out with the particular quality of something retrieved from a depth, something he'd held onto through the surgery and the anesthesia and the preceding hours of blood loss and controlled catastrophe. "Prior, we know," she said. "Rest. He's not." He stopped. Breathed. "He's not done. Tonight wasn't Jonas." She said his name the way she'd said it in the trauma bay, direct and grounding, the name as an anchor. "I know," Solis knows. "It's being handled." She paused. "You did your part. You brought it here. You got it to people who could do something with it." She looked at him steadily. "Rest now." He looked at her. His eyes were closing again, the anesthesia reasserting its claim, but since his face had changed in some way, she couldn't fully name some of the held tension releasing. Some weight he had been carrying through everything redistribution to whatever place a person's held weight went when they were finally allowed to set it down. "You should have," he started and stopped and started again. "You should have gotten credit 3 years ago. You should have." He lost the thread. His eyes closed the rest of the way. She stood there for a moment after his eyes closed. Then she went back to the ER. The federal processing of Harborview General took the remainder of the night and extended into the early morning. By 6 a.m., there were 12 federal agents in the building, a forensic team in the parking structure, and 2 investigators in the security office reviewing Owusu's monitor records, frame by frame. The 3 operatives Mara and Solis had secured were in federal custody. The 4th man, from the supply room corridor, was in the same custody and had not said a useful word since sitting down on the floor with his hands on his knees, which Solis said was consistent with someone who had received thorough preparation for exactly this outcome. At 6:30, a woman arrived at the hospital who had not been part of any of the preceding night's events. She was tall, late 50, in civilian clothing that did not make her look civilian, and she walked through the ER entrance with 2 people peeing behind her, who positioned themselves at the threshold without being asked and stayed there. She found Mara at the nurse's station, the same chair, a second cold cup of coffee, and introduced herself with a name and a position that Mara heard and processed without visible reaction. She was high enough up that her presence here, in person, at 6:30 in the morning in a regional trauma center in Norfolk, Virginia, was itself a statement about what the preceding night had produced. "I read Solis's report on the transit," the woman said. She did not sit down. She stood across the station from Mara, with her hands at her sides and her posture that of someone who was accustomed to standing in places that required her to hold herself in a particular way. "I also read the documents recovered from the parking structure." She paused. "And I read your service record, the complete version." Mara looked at her. "What you did 3 years ago, what you documented, and what you reported, and what was done with that report is going to be the subject of a significant investigation. The individuals who buried it, the program that continued after you left, and the events of tonight are going to be examined together. Which means a number of people who have been comfortable for 3 years are going to become very uncomfortable." "And Prior," Mara said. "Prior is a priority. He knows where I am," she said. "He knew before tonight. He's been watching this building for 6 weeks." "Yes." The woman held her gaze, "which is why I want to make you an offer." Mara waited. "Your record can be unsealed," the woman said. "Fully, with official acknowledgement of your service and the commendations that were suppressed. You would receive the formal recognition that was denied after the Kaveri operation." She paused. "And if you wanted to return to service in a medical capacity. There is a position attached to a unit whose work would be familiar to you. Mara looked at the nurse's station. At the board behind it, the patient assignments, the room numbers, the names in dry erase marker that she had been reading and updating and moving around for 2 years and 8 months of night shifts. At the crash cart, she had restocked herself because someone hadn't done it. At the trauma bay where a boy with a blown pupil had come in at 11:40, and she had made a decision with a borrowed syringe and a resident who had trusted her enough to act on it. She looked at the woman across the station. "I'll think about the return to service," she said. "The record, yes, unseal it." "That's not for me," she said it plainly, without decoration. "That's for the people whose names are on that list in the van. The ones who are already marked. If my record is unsealed and my testimony is on record, it makes their accounts harder to dismiss." She looked at the woman steadily. "That's the reason to do it." The woman looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded slowly, with the particular respects of someone who had encountered something she hadn't fully expected. "There's one more thing," the woman said. Her voice changed register slightly, not lower, just more. The documents in the van contained the operational architecture of the program, the chain of command, the funding structure, the contracted relationships. She paused. The funding ran through a civilian entity, a medical institution. Mara's attention sharpened. "Not this hospital," the woman said, reading her face. Pryor had no institutional connection to Harborview, but the entity that funded his program's civilian operations. That entity has a compliance board, and one of the members of that board is someone whose name you know from a different context. She placed a single sheet of paper on the nurse's station surface. Mara looked at it. The compliance board listed 5 names. She read them in order, and the 4th name stopped her, and she read it again. And then she looked up. "He's been on that board for 2 years, the woman said. "Since 6 months after you arrived at this hospital." Mara looked at the name, Dr. Wade Corbin. Mara looked at the name for a long time. Not because she needed to read it again. She had read it correctly the first time, and her mind had processed it correctly, and the implications had arranged themselves in the correct order without requiring additional review. She looked at it because there was a specific kind of information that needed to be held for a moment before you acted on it. Information that changed the shape of preceding events, that reached backward through time and recontextualized things you thought you had understood. The shove in the trauma bay, the deliberate removal from a patient's bedside, the 2 years and 8 months of systematic dismissal from a man who had known, for at least 2 of those years, exactly who she was and exactly what she represented to the people who wanted her gone. He had not been trying to humiliate her. He had been trying to make her leave. There was a difference, and the difference mattered, and she sat with it for the length of time it took her to understand it fully. Then she looked up at the woman across the station. "He knew who I was," Mara said. "We believe he was given your civilian identity approximately 2 years ago. Yes. Whether he was told the full context or only enough to understand that keeping you marginal and isolated served certain interests, we don't know yet." The woman's voice was measured. "What we know is that he joined the compliance board 6 months after your arrival here, and that the board's primary function was to provide institutional legitimacy to the program's funding structure." "He didn't report it," Mara said. "When the operatives came in tonight, he didn't try to help them. No, and he went back to the table." She thought about Corbin on the OR floor, with his gloved hands raised, still trying not to contaminate the field. About his voice when he said Real's pressure was holding. About the way he had looked at her in the anteroom doorway and said what he said. He didn't know what the board was funding, or he told himself he didn't. "That's a distinction," the woman said carefully, "that investigators will spend some time on." "It should be," Mara said. She stood up from the chair. Her body registered the movement with a comprehensive inventory of the night's damage, the jaw, the elbow, the general systemic fatigue of sustained adrenaline, and its withdrawal. a stiffness across her shoulders that she knew from experience would be significantly worse by afternoon. She registered all of it and moved anyway, because the alternative was sitting still with the name on that paper, and she was done sitting still with things she couldn't change. "I want to talk to him," she said. The woman looked at her. I'm not asking to conduct an investigation. I'm not asking to be in the room when your people question him." She held the woman's gaze steadily. "I want 5 minutes, before any of that starts. I want to look at him and say what I need to say." She paused. "He said something to me in the OR doorway. He doesn't get to leave this hospital tonight without understanding what that cost." The woman looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that assessed, rather than considered reading Mara's face for what was actually behind the request, whether it was anger, whether it was something that would complicate what came next. Whatever she found, she nodded. 5 minutes, she said. "One of my people will be in the room." Corbin was in the surgical attending lounge on the 3rd floor, the same floor, 3 rooms down from OR 2. A small space with a couch and a coffee maker and a window that looked out at the parking structure, where the forensic team was still working under portable lights at 7 in the morning. He was sitting on the couch with a cup of coffee in both hands, and the specific expression of a man who had survived a night that had taken more from him than he expected to give, and was now sitting inside the gap between what he'd survived and what came next. He looked up when Mara came in. The federal agent who had come in with her positioned herself near the door and became architecturally still. Corbin looked at Mara's jaw, at the wrapped elbow, at the overall state of her, which was not good and was honest about not being good. He looked like he wanted to say something about it and decided not to. "They told me you wanted to talk," he said. "Yes." She sat in the chair across from the couch. Not close. She was not going to perform a confrontation, and she was not going to perform a reconciliation. She sat in the crust saltboyer and looked at him across the coffee table with its medical journals and its empty creamer cups and said what she had come to say. "You knew who I was," she said. He looked at his coffee. "Not everything," he said. "They told me you had a military background that had created, that there were people who had an interest in you leaving this area, leaving this hospital." He stopped. "They told me your presence here was a liability. That if I wanted to keep the institutional relationship, the funding, I needed to make your position here untenable. So you did it," she said. He stopped again. His hands tightened on the cup. "I told myself you would resign, that you'd find another hospital, that you'd just go somewhere else, and it would be fine. You shoved me into a supply cart," she said, "in front of residents and nurses, over a patient with a blown pupil whose life I helped save while you were on your phone. I know. You did it more than once. You did it for 2 years. And somewhere in the back of your mind you knew that the reason you were doing it wasn't because I was incompetent. It was because someone paid you to make me uncomfortable enough to leave." He said nothing. The nothing was its own kind of answer. "The worst part," Mara said, and her voice was even, completely even. The voice she used in trauma bays, "isn't that you did it. People make bad decisions when they're afraid, or when money is involved, or when they tell themselves the harm they're causing isn't really harm." She looked at him. "The worst part is that you're a genuinely skilled surgeon. Tonight proved that, whatever else you are, you're the real thing in that OR. And you spent 2 years using that position to diminish someone who was also the real thing, because it was convenient for you." Corbin set the coffee cup down on the table. "I know," he said again. The 2 words had a different weight this second time. Not the reflexive acknowledgement of someone caught, not the reflexive acknowledgement of someone caught, but the heavier at something could not look avoided looking at and could not look away from anymore. "I'm not going to tell you how to feel about that," Mara said. "I'm going to tell you that the investigators are going to ask you questions about the board and your role in it, and that what you say and how you say it is going to determine a significant portion of what comes next for you. And I'm going to tell you that the man you helped save tonight on that table, Jonas, Realis, alive, because you went back to work when I told you to. She paused. Both of those things are true at the same time. That's the situation you're in. She stood up. Mara, he said. She looked at him. What I said in the ore doorway, he said. About putting my hands on you. I meant it. I know you meant it, she said. Meaning it is the beginning. It's not the end. She walked out. The morning arrived, the way February mornings arrived, in Norfolk gray and indifferent, the light coming up without enthusiasm over a waterfront that had been cold for months and would be cold for months more. Mara stood at the window at the end of the third-floor corridor and watched it come and felt the specific exhaustion of a body that had been running on stress chemistry for 8 hours and was now running on the residue of that, which was its own distinct kind of tired. Solis found her there at 7:40. Corbin is being interviewed, she said. She stood beside Mara at the window, without preamble, looking at the same gray light. He's talking. Voluntarily. His attorney got here 20 minutes ago and recommended against it, and he talked anyway. She paused. He doesn't know everything about the board's operations, but what he knows is enough to corroborate the document trail from the van. What happens to him? Mara said. Criminal exposure depends on what the investigation finds. He was a funding conduit, not an operational participant. He didn't direct the operatives. He didn't know the full scope. Solis considered this. His medical license, that's a separate process. The state board will be notified. The conduct toward you, independent of the board involvement, is reportable. There are nurses who watched it happen, Mara said. For 2 years. They didn't report because she stopped. Because the system made it clear that reporting wouldn't go anywhere. That he was too senior, too essential. That's going to change, Solis said. Is it? What happened in this building last night is going to be reviewed by a significant number of people at a significant number of levels. The institutional culture that allowed a surgeon to physically remove a qualified nurse from patient care because someone paid him to, that's going to be part of that review. Solis turned and looked at her. I can't promise you how it resolves, but I can tell you it will not be quiet. Mara looked at the parking structure. The forensic team was still there, the portable lights now competing with the arriving daylight. The van was being processed by people in coveralls with numbered bags. Garrett, she said. Concussion, superficial laceration, deeply irritated, Solis said, with the first trace of something approaching dry humor that Mara had heard from her. He's fine. He's been trying to file his report from the medical bay for the last hour, and they keep asking him to lie down. Sounds right, Mara said. Dario, your Ortec is conscious. Mild concussion, no other injuries. He's asking what happened, and nobody's given him a straight answer yet. Someone should, Mara said. He was in there. He deserves to know what he was in the middle of. Solis nodded. Owusu is being checked out and refusing to be admitted, which his doctor says is medically inadvisable, and Owusu says is non-negotiable. So that's resolved itself. A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. The silence of two people who had operated through something together and were now on the other side of it, standing in the space between what happened and what came next. Prior, Mara said. Still active pursuit. He crossed into Maryland. We have traffic camera confirmation from 4:20 this morning. He's heading north. We have people ahead of him. Solis's voice was precise and confident. He ran without his operational infrastructure, without his documents, without his team, without his communications setup. Every step he takes now is improvised, and improvised leaves traces that prepared doesn't. He's been improvising his whole career, Mara said. Yes, but he's been improvising from a position of control. This is the first time in 3 years he's been improvising from a position of exposure. Solis looked at her. There is a difference, and he knows it, which means he's scared, and scared people make decisions that confirm the fear. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then the two from the unit, the ones unaccounted for, Riordan and Park. Solely said the names with the care of someone who understood what they meant to the person she was saying them to. We located Riordan at 0600. He's in Portland, Oregon. He's fine. He didn't know he was on the list. She paused. Park. We're still working on Park's location. We have reason to believe she's been off-grid intentionally for the last 8 months, which may mean she found out and ran, or may mean she has an unrelated reason. We don't know yet. When you find her, you'll know. I told you. Mara nodded. She looked at the window. At the gray morning beyond it. Go home, Solus said. Not unkindly. Sleep. There will be interviews and statements and a significant amount of formal process starting in the next 24 hours, and you need to be functional for it. Go home. Real is in the ICU with 2 federal agents and an ICU team that knows what they're doing. He's not going anywhere. Solus looked at her with the direct, even regard that Mara had come to understand. Was simply how Solus looked at people she had decided to take seriously. You did enough tonight. Go. She did not go straight home. She went to the ICU first, not to go in, just to stand at the window of the anteroom and look through the glass at the room where Real was, the monitors steady, the team present, the quiet, controlled busyness of intensive care going about its work around him. She stood there for 3 minutes. She did not know exactly what she was doing there, or what she needed from those 3 minutes. She stood there until she felt something settle in her chest. Not resolution, not completion, just the specific relief of confirmation that what she had fought for was still there, still breathing, still holding. Then she went home. Her apartment was exactly as she had left it at 10:45, the previous evening dishes in the drying rack, a book open face down on the arm of the couch, the specific organized plainness of a space that a person had arranged for function rather than comfort. She stood in the middle of it for a moment and felt the full weight of the nightland on her body, all at once, the way that weight always waited until you were somewhere you could afford to feel it. She sat on the couch. She did not cry, not because she was preventing it. She was not preventing anything. She simply sat with what had happened and let it be what it was, a night that had asked everything she had and received everything she had and left her here, on this couch, in this apartment, with a wrapped elbow and a bruised jaw, and the knowledge that somewhere in Maryland a man named Danik Pryor was driving north in the dark and running out of road. She thought about the call sign. Sparrow. She had not heard it in 3 years. She had not said it to herself, had not said it think it, had not let herself think it, had wrapped it in the same deliberate silence. She had wrapped everything else from that time. She had thought that was protection. She had thought that was protection. She had thought if she did not hold those things, they could not be used against her. What she understood now, sitting on the couch at 7:50 in the morning in a gray February in Norfolk, was that she had not left those things behind. She had carried them the entire time. The way her hands moved in a trauma bay. The way she mapped every building she worked in. The way she had heard the frequency change in Dolores's voice from 2 rooms away and known before she turned the corner that something had shifted. You could leave the uniform. You could leave the call sign. You could change your name in every system that mattered and build a new context around yourself and show up every night and do good work and tell yourself you had become someone simpler, someone quieter, someone with less history. But the training did not unknow itself. The instincts did not unform. The part of you that had learned to keep people alive under impossible conditions did not retire when you changed your scrub's color. She had spent 3 years treating that as something to manage. Yet, she was not sure anymore that it was. She slept for 4 hours. The formal statement process began 2 days later and lasted the better part of a week. Mara gave her account to 3 separate investigators across 4 sessions, each time in a conference room at a federal building in downtown Norfolk with Solus present and a lawyer she had retained. A compact, sharp woman named Ellery Marsh, who had been recommended by Garrett, of all people, via a text message sent from the Harborview Medical Bay between attempts to file his incident report from a hospital bed. Marsh sat beside Mara in each session and said almost nothing, because almost nothing needed to be said. Mara's account was clear, sequential, and consistent, and the physical evidence from the building corroborated every material point. On the third day, Mara's sealed service record was officially opened. The notification came through Solis, who drove to Mara's apartment in person to deliver it. Not because the situation required a personal delivery, but because Solis had made a determination about how this specific thing should be communicated and had acted on it with the same quiet decisiveness she applied to everything else. She sat across from Mara at the kitchen table and put a folder between them and said nothing while Mara opened it. The record was 23 pages. Mara read all of them. The commendations were there. 4 of them, as Solis had said, 3 of standard military classification, and 1 that required the specific authorization level that had kept it invisible for 4 years. The 4th one was for the Kaveri operation. It described, in the careful, abbreviated language of official military documentation, the actions of a combat medical specialist who had maintained the survivability of 4 critically wounded operators over a period of 11 hours under sustained hostile engagement, who had applied advanced surgical intervention in field conditions without access to a surgical suite or adequate supplies, and who had subsequently produced a detailed report of observed program irregularities that had been received by her commanding officer and, as now confirmed, deliberately suppressed. The language was official, stripped down, the kind of prose that removed the person from the event and described only the event. Reading it, she could put the person back in. She remembered the cold. The specific cold of that region in that season, and the sound of the engagement that had not stopped for hours, and the fact that she had run out of 1 medication at the 4-hour mark and had made decisions about what to prioritize that she had not second-guessed at the time and had second-guessed every subsequent year. She remembered the face of each of the 4 men she had kept alive, remembered them specifically. Not as abstractions, not as the nameless recipients of her skill, but as people with names and habits and the particular expressions of men who were in more pain than they were acknowledging and were grateful for someone who did not require them to perform otherwise. She closed the folder. "The 4th commendation," she said. "It's going in my official record." "Yes," Solis said. "All of them are, yes. And the notation about the report being received and buried. That's already in the investigator's materials," Solis said. "Commanding officer who buried it. He retired 3 years ago. He's being interviewed. His legal team has already been in contact with the agency." Mara set her hands flat on the table. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "I am not asking for any of this because I need the validation. I spent 3 years being told directly and indirectly that my account of what happened didn't matter, and that what I had done didn't count, and that the correct thing for me to do was disappear and stop taking up space." She looked at Solis. "I know what I did. I knew it then, and I've known it every day since. I didn't need a file to confirm it." "I know," Solis said. "But other people do," Mara said. "The people on that list in the van. The people from the unit who have been living with the same silence I was living with. Some of them, maybe not even knowing why things went the way they went after that operation. They need the record to be accurate. Not for me, for the whole account." Solis nodded slowly. "The unsealing is being communicated to the surviving members of the unit. All of them who can be reached." She paused. "Park was located yesterday. She's in Anchorage. She's fine. She found out about the list 4 months ago and went off-grid by choice. Solis allowed herself a small, precise exhale, very angry and very fine. Something in Mara's chest moved. "Good," she said. "That sounds right." Corbin resigned from Harborview General on the 4th day. He submitted a written resignation to the hospital board along with a voluntary disclosure to the State Medical Licensing Authority that outlined his involvement with the Compliance Board, his receipt of institutional funding tied to that involvement, and his conduct toward nursing staff over a period extending well beyond his involvement with the board conduct he characterized, in the language of the disclosure, as a systematic abuse of positional authority that he had rationalized for years and could no longer rationalize. The disclosure was not required. His attorney had, by multiple accounts, argued against it. He submitted it anyway. The hospital board received it and opened an internal review. 3 nurses on the night shift woman, who had watched Mara be shoved and overridden and dismissed for 2 years, who had said nothing because the institutional Mathesnik had consistently told them that saying something would cost them more than staying quiet, contacted the review committee within 48 hours of the review's announcement. Their accounts were specific, documented with dates and witnesses, and consistent with each other and with Mara's. Dolores, who had worked Harborview's night shift for 14 years and had seen 3 senior physicians cycle through positions of authority and had learned very early the particular discipline of managing powerful men without confronting them directly, submitted a 12-page written account that she had apparently composed in a single sitting the morning after the night of February 7th. Mara read it when Dolores sent her a copy. It was one of the most precise documents she had ever encountered. Not because of the writing Dolores wrote, the way Dolores spoke, direct and without ornamentation, but because of the memory behind it. Dolores had recorded dates, times, specific incidents, specific words used. She had been keeping a record for 2 years, quietly, in a notebook in her locker, with no clear plan to use it. Just keeping it, the way some people kept things, because she had known on some level that a record kept was a record available, and that availability mattered even when you couldn't see exactly when or how. Mara called her. "I didn't know you were keeping that," Mara said. "Of course you didn't," Dolores said. "It wasn't for you to know. You had enough to manage without knowing someone was watching out for the receipts." Mara was quiet for a moment. "Thank you. Don't thank me. I should have done something with it sooner. I told myself the time wasn't right. I told myself it wouldn't go anywhere." Dolores was quiet for a beat. "I was wrong about that. The institution made that calculation seem rational," Mara said. "It did. And the institution was wrong. And I let it be wrong longer than I should have." Her voice had the specific quality of someone who had made their own accounting and was not asking to be relieved of it. "That's on me, not on you." They talked for 11 more minutes about things that were not the statement, the review, or the investigation, about how Real's ICU numbers were improving, about whether Finch was going to apply for an emergency medicine fellowship, about the pediatric patient from the night of February 7th, the 7-year-old boy with the blown pupil, who had been discharged from the neurology unit on day 3 with a follow-up appointment scheduled, and a mother who had left a handwritten card at the nurse's station that nobody had thrown away. Pryor was apprehended on the 9th day. He was found in a motel outside of Wilmington, Delaware, not hiding, not actively running, but sitting in a motel room with a burner phone and the specific stillness of a man who had exhausted his options and was waiting for the options to resolve themselves. The agents who apprehended him reported that he did not resist. He sat in the motel room chair and looked at the door when they came through it and said nothing. Solis called Mara with the news from the field. "He's in custody," she said. "Federal charges. The list is long. Conspiracy, attempted murder, unlawful detention, weapons charges, and that's before the full accounting of the program's activities over the last 3 years." She paused. "He'll be arraigned Monday." Mara stood at her apartment window and looked at the waterfront. The February cold had broken slightly, the particular quality of light that suggested the season was not done, but was beginning to consider its exit. "The others," she said, "from the program. The investigation is ongoing. The board documentation gives us a chain we can follow. There are people at multiple levels of institutional authority who are going to have significant questions to answer." Solis paused. "This doesn't close in a week, Mara. It's going to be months, maybe longer. But it's open. It's on record. It can't be buried again. No, Mara said. It can't. She went back to Harborview General on the 11th day. Not because she had to. Her leave had been extended at the hospital's initiative, the administration, navigating the complex institutional position of having been the site of a federal operation, while also so being the place where several of its own failures had become very visible, and she had no requirement to return before she was ready. She went because the alternative was continuing to sit in her apartment with 4 hours of sleep and an inventory of things that had happened, and no motion toward what came next. She went in through the ER entrance at the start of the night shift, wearing the navy scrubs she had worn for 2 years, and 8 months of night shifts, with her badge clipped to her chest and the wrapped elbow that Finch had rewrapped that morning, down to a compression sleeve. Dolores was at the nurse's station. She looked up when Mara came through the door. She looked at her for one moment with the expression of a woman who had worked this floor for 14 years and had seen people come back after things that should have kept them away. Then she looked at the board. Bay 4 has a femur fracture that's been waiting on pain management for 20 minutes, she said. Bay 7 has a chest pain workup that needs a second set of eyes on the EKG. And Bay 2, she paused, has a 9-year-old girl with a hand laceration who is terrified of needles and has been crying since she got here. I'll take 2, Mara said. She walked through the ER toward Bay 2. The girl was small, brown-haired, sitting on the edge of the exam table with her injured hand wrapped in a towel that was doing its best and the specific, hunched posture of a child who has decided that if she makes herself small enough, the bad thing might miss her. Her mother was beside her with a hand on her back, looking up when Mara came in with the reflexive parental assessment of a new person entering proximity to her child. Mara sat down on the rolling stool and brought herself to the girl's eye level. The girl looked at her, at the badge, at her face. I'm Mara, she said. I'm your nurse tonight. She looked at the wrapped hand. Can I see? The girl hesitated. Then she extended the wrapped hand, slowly, with the trust of someone making a decision they were not fully certain about. Mara took it carefully. She unwrapped the towel and looked at the laceration clean, not deep, the kind of cut that would need 3 or 4 sutures and heal without complication. She held the girl's hand in both of hers and did not look at the wound anymore. She looked at the girl's face. Here's what's going to happen, she said. I'm going to put some medicine on your skin that makes it stop feeling things for a little while. It goes on like a cream, no needles for that part. She watched the girl process this. And while we wait for that to work, which takes about 10 minutes, you can tell me how this happened if you want. Or we can just sit here. Both are fine. The girl looked at her for a long moment with the particular gravity that children brought to assessing adults, the honest, unmediated assessment of someone who had not yet learned to pretend they trusted people they didn't. You're really a nurse? She said. Mara smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that started in the jaw rather than the mouth, slightly asymmetric because of the bruising that was still fading on the left side, not glamorous, not composed. That's exactly who I am, she said. She had been dismissed and shoved aside and systematically diminished and hunted across 3 years and one long February night that had asked everything she had. She had been told in every language that institutions used to tell people this, that she was less than what she was, that her knowledge was incidental, her presence inconvenient, her history irrelevant, her silence the appropriate response to people who had decided she didn't count. She had kept showing up anyway. Not because she was fearless. She had been plenty afraid in the stairwell with a dying man on a gurney, afraid in the oar, with rounds coming through the window glass. Afraid in a motel room 3 years ago when she first understood what she had survived and what it would cost her to tell the truth about it. Fear was not the absence of courage. It was the raw material of it. The thing you moved through, not around. She had kept showing up because the work was real. Because the 7-year-old boy with the blown pupil was real, and the man on the surgical table was real, and the girl in front of her right now with her lacerated hand and her terror of needles was real. And real things needed someone who showed up without conditions. That was not a small thing. She had spent 3 years treating it as a small thing, treating herself as a small thing, hiding in the plainness of a night shift, arranging her life around the principle of minimum footprint, as if the best thing she could offer the world was to be as invisible as possible. As if the people who had wanted her silent and erased had been right about the value of her presence. They had not been right. They had been afraid. People who were powerful and afraid used the tools of power to manage the things that frightened them. They buried reports and shuffled compliance boards and installed diminishing men in positions where they could sand down the edges of anyone who got too close to inconvenient truths. They had looked at her and seen a threat, and the form their fear took was a sustained effort to make her doubt that what she was worth anything. She had almost let them win. Not once, many times, across 3 years of quiet nights and cold coffee, and swallowing the particular kind of humiliation that comes from knowing what you're capable of, and being told by every available institutional signal that it doesn't matter. She had not let them win, not because she had been brave, because she had been psychologically, professionally, because she had been stubborn and tired, and because somewhere underneath the deliberate plainness she had constructed around herself, she had never quite believed the story they were telling about her. The cream went on the girl's hand. The girl watched it happen and did not pull away. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "The cream?" "No," Mara said. "This part doesn't hurt." The girl looked at her hand. Then she looked at Mara's face, at the fading bruise along the jaw, which was visible now in the bay's clinical light. "Did you get hurt?" she said. "A little," Mara said. "I'm okay now. What happened?" Mara looked at the girl's face. At the honest, unmediated question of someone who asked because they genuinely wanted to know and had not yet learned to manage their curiosity in the interests of social smoothness. "I had a hard night at work," she said, "but things turned out okay." The girl considered this with the gravity she had brought to everything. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and looked back at her hand. "My teacher says nurses are really important," she said. "Your teacher's right," Mara said. "She says they do a lot of stuff that doctors get credit for." Mara looked at the girl for a moment. Then she said, "Sometimes." "Yeah, that's not fair." "No," Mara said. "It's not." The girl looked up at her with the clear, uncomplicated directness of someone who had not yet been taught to accept unfair things as simply the way things were. As if the unfairness was not an immutable feature of the world, but a problem that existed, because nobody had gotten around to fixing it yet. Mara looked back at her with the same directness. "You're right," she said. "It's not fair. And some things that aren't fair can be changed." She checked the cream on the girl's hand, assessed the local anesthetic effect good, even coverage. The girl hadn't flinched at the assessment touch. "Ready?" The girl took a breath. "Ready," she said. Outside the bay, the ER continued its nighttime operations, the board turning over, the monitors alarming and being answered, the particular organized motion of a place that dealt in urgency and kept doing it night after night, because the urgency did not stop, and neither did the people who had decided this was the work they were going to do. Mara worked within it the way she always had, without ceremony, without announcement, moving from patient to patient with the efficient authority of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and did not require anyone's permission to do it. She had never needed the title or the recognition or the formal acknowledgement of what she was capable of. She had needed the record to be accurate. It was accurate now. The rest, the work, the presence, the choice to keep showing up, that had always been hers. It had always been enough.